hi, Michelle. Warm welcome to the Tech Success Podcast. So do you want to sort of say hello to the audience and then kind of tell us a little bit more about you?
Yeah, so hi, thanks for having me. My name is Michelle Gyimah, and I'm the founder of a pay gaps consultancy called Equality Pays. And essentially what we do is we work with organizations to help them make sense of their pay gap data so that they can create strategies that genuinely work for them.
Brilliant. Well, welcome, Michelle. And I suppose I'm going to go into the first question. What are the most significant trends you've observed in gender pay gap reporting over the last 7 years? So it's a big question to start with.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing is that it's no longer like a niche secret conversation, because obviously prior to pay gap reporting, only a few people within each organization would have had access to that data. Because it's now a mainstream conversation, it means that less people are fearful around talking about it and asking questions and, using the data to make their own kind of career decisions. So I guess it's been a success in that sense, in that it's raised the profile of this as an issue that organizations need to kind of fix. In terms of trends, well, we have seen that there's been really modest changes in terms of how the pay gap has, dropped nationally and from sector to sector. The financial services sector still has consistently the biggest pay gaps. But for the technology sector, what we actually have seen is that they've experienced the most decreases in their pay gaps. However, still higher than the national average. So there's still work to be done. And the other thing that I would say also is what we have noticed is that when pay gap reporting first started, it was very much a case of these are the numbers, publish them, and your job is to reduce them. What we're starting to see now is that people are becoming much more savvy and understand that it's not always as simple as that. Like some companies will struggle to achieve that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not doing any work or they're not actually making progress. And in a report that I read called What Women Want, they found that 55% of women would still apply for a role at a company that had a high gender pay gap, as long as the company could demonstrate what their commitments were, what they were going to be doing about it, and what actions they were taking. So, we're starting to see people be a bit more savvy and starting to look beyond those pay gap figures and ask much more meaningful questions so that they have a better understanding of what is actually happening within companies.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I suppose also historically, dependent on if the firm had a lot of females at the top table, some of those historic males, perhaps, that were at the top table may have just been paid more because they've been in the business longer. And it's actually, I suppose it needs to be done on kind of the role profile rather than actually just a job title.
Yeah. And I suppose, that kind of leads into the equal pay issue. Like, are men and women being paid equally for the same job? What the pay gap looks at is, well, where are women placed within organizations? And we know from the data that, there isn't a sector that doesn't have a gender pay gap. So there is something happening, or has been happening culturally, where the further up you go into organizations, the less women that you see. And that's the same even for female dominated sectors and organizations. So, the question, it starts looking at the economic aspect, but I guess it's really delving into what are we doing societally, what are we doing culturally, and then how are businesses replicating those issues.
Mm-hmm. I know, I suppose I've seen firsthand, there's a lot of women I've worked for that wouldn't ask when their male counterparts might. So it's interesting, really interesting topic. So what are the common mistakes organizations make when addressing their gender pay gap?
Well, for me, I would say the biggest mistake that I've seen is really focusing on this as like a maths problem or a numbers game. So, for example, company A has a pay gap of, I don't know, say 28%. And that makes them feel very uncomfortable about themselves. They're worried about what that perception means, what people will think, what the repercussions of having that data out there will look like. So the most natural reaction is to say, right, we need to reduce this because it doesn't make us look good. And whilst I understand that, because that's the nature of pay gap reporting, that it's public and people have this information, can ask questions, focusing solely on just reducing the pay gap figure because you're worried about how it makes you look is not what it's really supposed to be about, because the pay gap figure itself can be influenced by so many things, some of which you have control over and some of which you don't. So when you kind of put all your eggs in one basket and you're asking your HR directors and teams to go and fix this, it's actually very difficult for them to do that. And it means that you start setting, unrealistic targets. So I see organizations doing things like saying, right, we must from now on have 50-50 shortlisting, so 50% women, 50% men. And whilst on paper that might be admirable, the impact in reality, it could have a really negative impact. And I've seen organizations really struggle to recruit people because they're not able to make that shortlist, So it's not necessarily that the intention is bad, but we need to think about what the impact is going to be if you're going to start putting these initiatives in place. And so, the mistake is just focusing on this as a numbers game, as a number that needs to be reduced, rather than asking yourself, okay, well, what's informing those numbers in the first place? What's happening within different parts of the organizations? Are there certain regions or teams or departments when there's real problems around recruitment or retention? Are there teams and departments that do this really well, and what could we learn from them? What is our sector like? There are so many things that influence why you have the pay gap in the first place, but reducing it down just to a number that needs to change, I think, is the biggest mistake that a lot of organizations have. And that's why they're really struggling to make any changes or the positive impact that they say that they want to.
Yes, yeah, I get that. I suppose with a lot of our clients we work with, they do sometimes ask us for gender balance shortlists. But what's great about when we do a review is that we can track when we lose females along the process, whether that's screening or whether that's at the interview stage or the offer stage, because it can help them adapt their techniques, ideas, education, everything, process, so that they will eventually probably hire more females into their business. And in some areas, the females, those talent pools just don't exist. We use like tech called Talent Edge, which is an internal kind of system that we've developed ourselves, and it will tell you, like, for example, in AWS, how many architects there are that sit in Birmingham. Well, if we've got a firm that are looking specifically to hire women into their business within that kind of stack and within that sort of skill set, we'd be able to say whether that's actually realistic or not, or how difficult it could be. And you may need to go to kind of, I don't know, remote working for certain skill types. So it's very interesting. You have to look at the big picture, don't you? So just going on to the next question, how can organizations use data from gender pay gap reporting to drive broader cultural change, not just compliance?
Yeah. So the thing that I always advise is that you should really see it as a catalyst. I think a lot of organizations see it as the be all and end all, like this is the thing that we have to do, and once we've reported, that's it. But really, you should be using it as an opportunity to try and understand your organization better, but through a different lens where maybe you haven't focused much attention before. So, for example, in the legislation, you have to produce your pay gap figure, but then you also have to produce your quartile pay gap figures. And that is where the rich data and information is, because then you can track and see, what does career progression look like? And you can start to ask those questions. And so that means you'll be delving into your recruitment, your retention, and your promotion. And so from there, you can start to ask those questions of, what does this look like if we were to split our, if we were to track our promotions, for example, within this quartile between men and women, what does that look like? And then it always gives you the opportunity to ask more questions. Well, why does it look like this? How has that come about? is that are there things that we could and should be doing differently, or is this, natural selection, as it were? So, using the data, the pay gap data that you have, and marrying it with, more data that you are likely to have within the organization, you'll be able to kind of dissect and investigate what the broader culture of your organization looks like, which will then be able to tell you why you have specific pay gaps in the first place. And it will help you to focus on the things that you do have control over, but it will also help you to understand the things that you don't have control over, because you won't be able to control every aspect of why you have a pay gap.
Yeah, makes sense. And what role does leadership play in successfully addressing gender pay gaps? How can leaders be more accountable? What do you think?
Yeah, well, it's vital, because it's very difficult for somebody who's kind of sat in the middle of an organization to implement change if they don't have that senior leadership buy-in. But having said that, there is a question to be asked in terms of what is the right type of buy-in. Because what I tend to see is that senior leaders are engaged. They want to see the pay gap figure reduced. But that is where the buy-in stops. It's this idea of our pay gap is X, that's not acceptable, we're going to set targets and we want it reduced. And on the face of it, you might think, okay, well, that sounds perfectly fine, perfectly logical. But if there is that lack of understanding of how the pay gap has arrived in the first place, if there isn't much insight into how it impacts your sector, maybe even your region, then it's actually very difficult for, HR directors to go and make that change. So for a lot of organizations, they've got the wrong type of buy-in. And what they have is a lot of pressure and stress from on top to make this thing happen with limited resources. So what organizations and senior leaders in particular really need to focus on is actually understanding what the pay gap is about beyond producing a figure every year that somebody can look at. So, you have to be very clear about your sectoral context. I mean, you said so yourself, sometimes that talent pool just isn't there. And then it's about understanding, okay, well, how much responsibility can we take as an organization to try and make changes there? How much of that is our responsibility? How much of that is a wider sectoral responsibility? And where can we focus our efforts? So really, it's going to be about shifting focus. So it's not to say to ignore the pay gap itself, but to understand that it has a time and place, but really and truly, it's about redefining what does success look like. Because yes, you might like to have a reduction in your pay gap, but success for you as an organization might look like the number of women that return to work after maternity leave improves, and that they stay for longer after having their first or second or subsequent children, because that might be your main problem. So it's about redefining success, but then also taking control of that narrative of being able to say, well, yes, our pay gap data, the figures don't look great. However, for us as an organization, here are the pain points that we have. Here's where we struggle to retain and attract, recruit, etc. And here are the things that we are focusing on, because this is what's good for our business and this is what's good for our culture. So it's really about understanding, senior leaders really understanding what the pay gap is, how it comes about, and where they should be focusing more of their efforts and providing more resources for their teams to be able to go ahead and do that work.
Yes, how they allocate budgets quite often, isn't it? Yeah. And I love a story. I think everyone learns from a story, don't they? So can you share a success story where a company not only closed its gender pay gap, but also saw, I suppose, unexpected business benefits as well?
Yeah, so when I was doing some research, I came across an organisation called CDP. So they were formerly Carbon Disclosure Project, and they're quite an interesting organisation, because they have reported on their pay gap for the last, I think it's 2 years. The first year that they reported on the pay gap, they didn't actually have 250 employees or more, because that's the threshold. But they decided that was what they wanted to do. So that in of itself I think tells you something about the organization and what they're about and what they're looking to do. And they were able to reduce their pay gap from 6% down to 1.2%. And what they talked about was the fact that so much of that was achieved through internal promotion. So they didn't need to hire people in or parachute people into certain roles. They were able to do it through, internal promotions. They obviously looked at, the cohort who they had. They obviously understood that there were issues around career progression, and they've made those changes. So the pay gap is reduced. Fantastic. They didn't have to recruit externally to do that. That's great. What time will tell is that this in of itself, they can put that information into their pay gap reports. They can talk about it, in their external marketing, but they're probably going to find it much more easier to attract a wider pool of people as they're going through their growth stage. So obviously that's going to be of great value to lots of women in the organization, outside of the organization, thinking about maybe, going to them. But it's also going to be attractive to a lot of other people who value this, because this isn't just, it's not a women's issue, it's a societal issue. It has impact for so many different cohorts. So, because what it does is that it shows that this organization is a progressive one, who are, getting ahead of the curve, doing things that they didn't need to do because they hadn't reached that threshold, but they've also been successful in doing so internally. Now, most people, when they join an organization, that's the thing that they want to know. What does career progression look like? Well, this organization has demonstrated that when they're really focused, they use the data in the right way, they can demonstrate that career progression. So I would imagine that for them, it's going to be much easier. They're going to stand out in the sector as an organization that is committed to and invests time and effort in career progression, not just for women, but for other people as well. And because they will be able to attract wider, more people, they'll have almost like, how would you say, the pick of the bunch, as it were, because people who feel that they have the skills to be able to work in that organization, they will kind of like place themselves there. So they'll probably see a much, broader remit of people from different sectors, different regions, different areas that want to come to them. So it's a really good attraction piece, and it's an excellent retention piece as well. If you see this happening in the organization, you'll be starting to think, well, that could be me. I'm already in, but this could be me. I could progress too. So for me, they are the key benefits that they will be seeing, if they're able to keep up the good work as they're going forward.
Yeah, massive impact on the success of the business then. Yeah, no, brilliant. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. It's really been insightful. And, I'd love to welcome you back in the future as well, continually educating our following, etc. So, yeah, look forward to welcoming you back, hopefully in 2025.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I've really, really enjoyed this episode. Thank you.